1 minute ago, everything changed. In a move that blindsided Washington, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has formally demanded access to a $95 billion defense alliance fund, a fund long considered strategically controlled, politically sensitive, and tightly guarded. And the timing? Not random, not accidental, strategic. Because this isn't just about money, it's about power. It started quietly. No dramatic leak, no chaotic press conference, just a formal communication delivered through diplomatic channels, requesting structured participation in a defense financial mechanism historically dominated by U.S. influence. Within minutes, policy circles lit up. Defense analysts paused. Congressional staffers scrambled. Because $95 billion isn't symbolic, it's leverage. The Defense Alliance Fund, designed to strengthen joint security operations, advanced weapons coordination, cyber defense integration, and rapid response infrastructure, has traditionally been steered by Washington's strategic priorities. Access means influence. Influence means positioning. And positioning means long-term power. Carney's request wasn't framed as confrontation. It was framed as partnership. But behind the language of cooperation lies something much larger. Canada is no longer asking to align. It is asking to participate in shaping. That's different, very different. According to insiders familiar with the structure, the fund supports multi-year defense innovation programs, intelligence sharing upgrades, satellite systems, Arctic monitoring, AI-driven surveillance technologies, and strategic deterrence modernization. Participation equals visibility. Visibility equals voice. And voice shifts balance. The demand reportedly emphasized three key arguments. First, Canada contributes significantly to joint defense operations. Second, North American security architecture is increasingly integrated. Third, modern threats require financial transparency and shared influence. But here's what stunned Washington. The number, $95 billion. Public confirmation of that figure immediately reframed the conversation. This wasn't about symbolic membership. This was about real control over capital allocation. And capital allocation defines priorities. Within hours, defense commentators began dissecting what this could mean. If Canada gains structured access, it gains insight into procurement timelines, technology investments, emerging defense platforms, and perhaps most importantly, strategic direction. That's powerful. Because defense funds aren't just military tools, they're geopolitical signals. Who controls funding controls momentum, and momentum defines dominance. Washington was not expecting this now. Sources suggest internal discussions about expanding Allied access had been ongoing, but gradual, controlled, measured. Carney accelerated the timeline. That acceleration is the story. The move comes amid rising global instability, Arctic militarization concerns, cybersecurity escalation, NATO burden-sharing debates, Indo-Pacific recalibrations. In this environment, financial access equals security authority, and security authority equals diplomatic weight. This wasn't framed as a demand publicly. It was framed as a formal request for structured inclusion. But language doesn't dilute impact. Inside the Pentagon, analysts reportedly evaluated immediate implications. Would expanded access require congressional oversight? Would it alter voting structures? Would it create precedent for other allies? Because if Canada enters, others may follow. And once the door opens, it doesn't close easily. This is where the power play becomes visible. Carney understands finance. He understands central banking. He understands capital deployment. He also understands that defense spending is one of the last remaining pillars of uncontested American global influence. Requesting structured participation in that pillar is bold, but it's calculated. If Washington rejects the request outright, it risks appearing exclusionary within an alliance framework. If it accepts too quickly, it redistributes influence. Either path carries consequence. That's leverage. A well-positioned request forces difficult choices, and difficult choices create negotiation space. Now consider timing. This request comes at a moment when defense spending globally is under scrutiny. Allies are debating burden sharing, budgets are tightening, public accountability is increasing. By stepping forward now, Canada positions itself as proactive, not reactive, as engaged, not dependent. That matters politically. Domestically, this strengthens Carney's leadership narrative. Internationally, it elevates Canada's role beyond supportive ally. It signals readiness to co-shape security architecture. Within 2 hours of the story breaking, Washington officials avoided direct comment. That silence was noticeable. Because in high-level defense finance discussions, silence signals evaluation, and evaluation signals seriousness. Market reaction was subtle but telling. Defense contractors saw mild volatility, not panic, but recalibration. Because if fund governance expands, procurement pathways may diversify. Diversification changes contract distribution. Contract distribution affects billions. This isn't symbolic diplomacy, it's structural positioning. The bigger question now, is this a one-time request or the beginning of broader defense governance reform? If Canada successfully secures access, even partial oversight, it sets precedent. Precedent spreads. Other close allies may demand similar structured roles. That shifts alliance hierarchy. And alliance hierarchy shapes global power perception. For decades, Washington has been the central architect of Western defense financing. Now, an ally is asking to co-design. That's historic, not hostile. Historic. There's another layer few are discussing publicly: Arctic strategy. As climate change accelerates Arctic accessibility, northern defense routes gain strategic importance. Canada controls significant Arctic geography. Shared funding could strengthen Arctic surveillance and infrastructure. But shared funding also strengthens Canadian leverage in regional decisions. Geography plus finance equals influence. Influence alters negotiation dynamics. Behind closed doors, advisors are now running scenarios. If access is granted, under what terms? If limited, what oversight model? If delayed, what diplomatic messaging? Every path must balance alliance unity with influence protection. That's delicate. But here's what makes this move especially sharp. Carney didn't threaten. He didn't criticize. He didn't escalate rhetoric. He requested inclusion within alliance logic. That makes rejection politically harder, because denying participation in a shared security framework contradicts cooperative messaging. This is financial diplomacy at its most refined. A $95 billion lever placed calmly on the table, not slammed, placed. And now Washington must decide whether to pick it up or push it away. Either choice reshapes perception. Either choice carries ripple effects. 1 minute ago, this was internal policy discussion. Now it's public geopolitical recalibration. Because once numbers enter headlines, they influence narrative, and narrative influences leverage. This is no longer just about a fund, it's about who steers the future of Western defense coordination. Carney just stepped into that conversation, and he did it without raising his voice. Washington did not expect this to go public. That's the first thing to understand. Requests like this, especially involving a $95 billion defense structure, are usually negotiated quietly, over months, sometimes years. Instead, the number hit headlines in hours. And once a number like $95 billion enters the public space, it becomes political. Inside Washington, 3 immediate scenarios are now being evaluated. Scenario 1, controlled acceptance. Grant Canada partial access, oversight committees, limited voting authority, structured transparency, without full capital influence. That preserves alliance unity while protecting primary control. Scenario 2, conditional delay. Announce a review panel, launch joint consultation, stretch the timeline. Delay buys time. But delay also signals hesitation, and hesitation can be interpreted as resistance. Scenario 3. Firm boundary. Reaffirm that governance remains under existing frameworks. That protects control, but risks diplomatic friction. Because Canada framed this as participation, not takeover. Rejecting participation creates optics, and optics matter in alliances. Now let's talk NATO. While this specific fund is not purely NATO-controlled, defense coordination in the Western alliance ecosystem is interconnected. If Canada gains deeper financial integration in North American defense allocation, it strengthens its voice in broader alliance strategy. Stronger voice means stronger negotiating posture in NATO modernization debates. Modernization debates mean budget alignment. Budget alignment means influence. And influence inside NATO isn't symbolic. It affects deployment decisions, infrastructure investment, emerging tech adoption, cyber defense standards. So when Carney places a $95 billion request on the table, he isn't just looking at one fund. He's positioning Canada for the next decade of defense architecture. That's long-game strategy. Now consider domestic American politics. Defense spending is one of the most politically protected budget categories in Washington. It creates jobs. It fuels innovation. It drives state-level economies. If governance broadens, procurement channels may shift. Defense contractors are watching carefully. Even small percentage changes in allocation authority can redirect billions. Markets reacted mildly, but analysts are recalculating models. Because if Canada gains co-shaping influence, joint projects could expand northward. Advanced Arctic systems, surveillance expansion, AI-driven defense analytics. That means contracts. Contracts mean power distribution. Power distribution means political sensitivity, and that's why this move feels bold. Now let's address the Arctic factor directly. The Arctic is no longer a frozen afterthought. Melting ice has opened new strategic pathways, shipping lanes, energy reserves, military positioning routes. Russia has increased Arctic militarization. China has signaled Arctic interest. The United States views Arctic security as a growing priority. Canada geographically anchors that region. If Canada gains deeper access to alliance funding mechanisms, Arctic infrastructure development becomes more bilateral, less centralized. That shifts strategic balance. Geography gives Canada leverage. Funding access amplifies that leverage. Leverage shapes negotiation dynamics. And here's the subtle brilliance of the timing. Global defense budgets are expanding. Threat environments are evolving. Cyber warfare is accelerating. Artificial intelligence is redefining battlefield intelligence. Carney didn't request access during stability. He requested it during transition. Transitions are when systems are most flexible, and flexible systems are easier to reshape. Washington now faces a delicate calculation: preserve control or adapt structure. Adapting structure doesn't mean losing dominance. It means sharing framework. But historically, framework sharing has been incremental. Carney just accelerated the conversation. Acceleration creates urgency. Urgency forces clarity. Clarity reveals priorities. And revealing priorities exposes power lines. There's also a diplomatic optics layer unfolding. If Washington appears dismissive, Canada could quietly strengthen defense industrial partnerships elsewhere, not abandoning the alliance, but diversifying within it. Diversification reduces dependency. Reduced dependency shifts power symmetry. Symmetry alters negotiation leverage. The word blindsided is appearing in commentary, but that may not fully capture the nuance. Washington wasn't unaware, but it wasn't prepared for public acceleration. Public acceleration limits private maneuvering, and limited maneuvering tightens options. Defense alliances rely on unity perception. Even when internal negotiations are intense, external messaging remains cohesive. Now the messaging must adapt, because the request is public, and the public watches numbers differently than policymakers do. $95 billion. That figure alone commands attention. Let's break down what access could practically mean. Access could involve participation in capital allocation committees, input on emerging defense tech prioritization, shared oversight on infrastructure modernization, joint review of intelligence-linked spending. Even 10 to 15% structured voting influence changes dynamics, because minority influence still shapes agenda direction. Agenda direction determines which threats receive priority funding. Priority funding defines operational focus. Operational focus shapes global posture. This is why analysts aren't dismissing the move. They're dissecting it, because beneath the diplomatic language lies structural ambition. But ambition isn't aggression, it's positioning. And positioning is a normal evolution in mature alliances. The question isn't whether Canada deserves a stronger voice. The question is how quickly Washington is willing to institutionalize that voice. Speed determines leverage. If Washington moves quickly to integrate Canada in defined terms, it controls narrative. If it hesitates, Canada retains narrative momentum. Momentum is powerful in geopolitics. It shapes perception. Perception influences alignment. Alignment defines coalition strength. Now zoom out further. Global security is fragmenting into regional power nodes. Europe consolidates. Asia rebalances. The Middle East recalibrates. North America cannot afford visible fragmentation. That's why both sides will tread carefully. But careful doesn't mean passive. It means calculated. And this entire episode has been calculated from the start. Carney understands capital strategy. He understands institutional design. He understands that influence grows through governance structures, not speeches. By requesting formalized participation in a $95 billion defense mechanism, he has elevated Canada's role conversation from supporting ally to co-architect. That shift alone changes perception. And perception in defense politics carries long shadows. So what happens next? Closed-door consultations, joint committees, legal framework reviews, language adjustments, potentially a phased integration model. But whatever the outcome, one reality is clear. Canada has stepped forward, not loudly, not confrontationally, but strategically. And Washington must now respond with equal precision. Because in alliance politics, silence is temporary, decision is inevitable. And once a decision is made, it signals more than approval or denial. It signals hierarchy. It signals trust. It signals the future structure of Western defense coordination. 1 minute ago, this was theoretical discussion. Now it's structural negotiation. And structural negotiations define decades. We are witnessing the early phase of a governance recalibration. Whether it becomes cooperative expansion or subtle tension depends entirely on the next move out of Washington. Now the political risk begins, because bold financial moves inside defense architecture always carry domestic consequences. For Carney, this is high reward, but also high exposure. If Washington integrates Canada meaningfully into the $95 billion framework, Carney secures a historic shift in Canadian strategic influence. But if Washington resists or limits access publicly, critics at home may argue the move overreached. This is calculated risk. Calculated because Carney understands something critical. In global politics, influence rarely increases without a formal request. Waiting for invitation keeps you secondary. Requesting inclusion forces evaluation. Evaluation forces response. And response defines hierarchy. Now let's examine Washington's internal pressure points. Congressional defense committees will immediately evaluate oversight implications, because access to a fund of this scale involves budget transparency, procurement guidelines, intelligence-linked allocation, long-term weapons development strategy. Even symbolic oversight adjustments require legislative clarity. That means hearings, closed-door briefings, national security assessments. The process alone signals seriousness, and seriousness shapes headlines. Now consider the defense industry. Major contractors rely on predictable allocation flows. If governance shifts, even slightly, competitive dynamics shift. Canadian defense firms could see expanded partnership roles. Joint development contracts may increase. Research collaboration might broaden. That changes profit projections. Market analysts are already calculating scenarios. Not panic, recalculation. Because $95 billion is not static capital. It moves annually through programs. Movement equals opportunity. Opportunity equals competition. Competition equals political attention. Here's where global markets step in. When defense governance debates become public, foreign observers analyze alliance cohesion. If cohesion appears strong, investment confidence remains stable. If cohesion appears fractured, currency and bond markets hedge. So far, market signals suggest confidence in diplomatic resolution. But resolution does not mean reversal. Even if Washington integrates Canada gradually, influence will have expanded. And expansion is permanent once formalized. Now let's zoom further out. The global defense landscape is shifting rapidly. Artificial intelligence integration, drone warfare expansion, cyber deterrence escalation, satellite defense militarization. Modern defense spending is not just about hardware. It's about digital infrastructure and strategic foresight. If Canada secures deeper financial inclusion now, it secures influence over future tech prioritization. Future tech defines next-generation deterrence. Next-generation deterrence defines global posture. Global posture defines leadership. This is why the phrase power play fits. Not because of aggression, but because of positioning. Carney did not demand control. He demanded structured participation. Participation sounds cooperative, but cooperative architecture still redistributes authority, and redistribution always feels dramatic inside established hierarchies. Now let's address NATO ripple potential. If Canada gains expanded financial governance influence within North American defense systems, European allies may push for similar models. Shared oversight councils, joint funding review panels, collaborative AI defense investment boards. That would decentralize Western defense decision-making gradually. Decentralization reduces singular dominance, but it can also increase alliance resilience. This is the paradox Washington must evaluate. Does shared governance weaken central control or strengthen long-term unity? History shows centralized systems act faster. Shared systems endure longer. Choosing between speed and durability is never simple. And here's where the real tension lies. The United States remains the dominant defense spender globally. Its financial contribution dwarfs most allies. But financial dominance does not automatically translate into governance exclusivity forever. As allies contribute more strategically, through geography, intelligence, infrastructure, governance pressure grows. Canada contributes Arctic positioning, NORAD integration, advanced surveillance capacity, and stable financial credibility. That combination strengthens its argument. This isn't about extracting funds. It's about co-directing allocation priorities. And that difference is everything. Now imagine the private conversations happening right now. Pentagon advisors modeling influence distribution. State Department officials assessing diplomatic optics. Canadian defense ministers outlining phased participation proposals. Phased participation may be the compromise. Limited access at first. Expanded influence over time. Structured oversight thresholds. Joint audit mechanisms. Each detail shapes future balance. And balance, once adjusted, becomes the new normal. We must also consider strategic messaging to rivals. If the West appears unified through structured inclusion, it signals modernization. If the West appears divided over governance, it signals vulnerability. That's why messaging precision is critical. No leader wants headlines suggesting alliance tension over money. But money defines structure, and structure defines capability. The real battle here is not confrontation, it's architecture. architectural control over $95 billion in strategic defense capital. That architecture influences the next 10 to 15 years of Western military readiness. That's generational impact. Now let's talk long-term consequences. If Canada succeeds, it elevates its global standing significantly. It becomes not just a participant, but a policy shaper. That shifts diplomatic leverage across trade, Arctic negotiations, and NATO modernization debates. If Washington resists firmly, it reinforces hierarchical structure, but risks subtle friction. Friction doesn't explode, it accumulates. Accumulation influences future cooperation tone, and tone defines alliance psychology. Here's the key insight. This move was not emotional, it was institutional. Institutional moves are harder to reverse than rhetorical ones. You can walk back a speech. You cannot easily walk back governance reform discussions. The $95 billion figure will now remain part of alliance conversation, even if access is limited, even if compromise narrows scope. The door has been opened, and once opened, expectations shift. Now we approach the final question. Is this a reshaping moment or a negotiation adjustment? The answer depends entirely on Washington's next statement, because in geopolitics, second moves matter more than first moves. First moves create options. Second moves define structure. Right now, Washington is calculating its second move, and the world is watching that calculation closely. Now everything comes down to one question. What does Washington do next? Because history shows something very clear. When allies request structural inclusion in power systems, the response defines the next decade. If Washington integrates Canada in a phased, controlled way, this becomes a modernization story. If Washington hesitates or publicly resists, this becomes a hierarchy story. And hierarchy stories carry long shadows. Let's be clear, this is not a crisis, not a rupture, not a breakdown. It is something more subtle. It is a recalibration of influence inside one of the most powerful defense ecosystems on Earth. $95 billion. That number now lives in public debate. And numbers like that don't disappear quietly. They anchor expectations. Now imagine this scenario. Washington announces a joint review framework. Canada gains advisory access, limited but formal. That alone shifts perception. Canada moves from supportive contributor to governance participant. That changes diplomatic tone in every future negotiation. Arctic security discussions, AI weapons funding, cyber defense coordination, satellite modernization programs. Because once you sit at the funding table, you shape the menu, and shaping the menu shapes strategy. But now imagine the alternative. Washington reaffirms centralized governance, keeps control intact, signals that current structure remains unchanged. If you found this breakdown sharp and valuable, hit like so this analysis reaches more people who want depth, not noise. Subscribe now for real-time geopolitical updates delivered fast, structured, and clear.